One of the great new features in the ASP.NET web stack is ASP.NET Identity. It's not specifically an MVC 5.0 feature. It's definitely something that can be used within MVC 5.0, but it's actually something that actually has much broader implications. Simply, it replaces the older membership and simple membership systems. If you remember in earlier versions of MVC, and particularly web forms, there were these concepts of membership providers and simple membership providers where basically baked into ASP.NET was the ability to handle users and roles and manage all of that information through this whole provider system. Well, ASP.NET Identity is now replacing that. It includes profile support, OAuth integration, and it works with something called OWIN, which we'll talk about shortly. Additionally, ASP.NET Identity is very forward-thinking. It actually provides two-factor authentication and integrates with third-party authentication platforms such as Google or Facebook. It's actually implemented using something called the OWIN standard, so it can be used with all ASP.NET frameworks, MVC, Web Forms, Web API, etc. It also works with web, store, and phone applications. So what exactly is this OWIN thing? OWIN stands for the Open Web Interface for .NET. Essentially, what OWIN seeks to accomplish is to isolate a web application from the platform that it's hosted on. Now, for most ASP.NET applications, we host them on a Windows server with IIS or up on Azure in the cloud, which is ultimately running IIS. The goal here is to actually separate the .NET or ASP.NET web applications from the specific platform so it doesn't have to be hosted on IIS or possibly even have to be hosted on Windows. Microsoft's implementation of this new standard is called Project Katana. Now, ASP.NET Identity is not dependent upon the system.web namespace or IIS. When talking about ASP.NET Identity in terms of OWIN, it's actually referred to as middleware. There's also other examples of middleware such as Web API 2 and SignalR. Both of these are actually implemented within the OWIN standard. What does that mean? That means that Web API 2 and SignalR are not dependent upon system.web, neither are they dependent upon IIS. The MVC platform itself is not OWIN, and it does rely upon the traditional ASP.NET platform running it on IIS, what have you. But when using ASP.NET Identity, our MVC applications actually become a mix of the more traditional ASP.NET platform and the new OWIN platform. An additional feature of ASP.NET Identity is that it is claims-based. Now, this is a little bit different from the traditional way of doing authentication and authorization with a typical web application. In the past, we had a user table, we had a roles table, which was mapped to some list of permissions, and the user would log in, they were a member of a role, and based upon the permissions that were assigned to that role, they could do certain things. But now, in a claims-based system, essentially, when a user logs in, information is provided by a claim that allows the application to make some type of decision concerning authentication or authorization. The information that's in a claim includes information about the user as well as the source of the information. So for example, in a claims-based system, I could log in using Google's platform. And so the claim that I would be presented with would be some information about me, the user who logged in, as well as the fact that that information comes from Google's platform or comes from Facebook or Twitter or what have you. All right, the source of that information could be that local identity database or that third-party source. Finally, claims are not specifically an ASP.NET MVC feature, although they can be used by ASP.NET MVC. Because ASP.NET Identity is an OWIN-based component, it's not limited only to MVC. It can be used with any number of ASP.NET platforms. For our ASP.NET Identity demo, we are going to create a new MVC 5.0 project with ASP.NET Identity added to it. We're then going to walk through all of the default ASP.NET Identity files that are added to the project as part of the project creation process. ASP.NET Identity is a huge topic, and because it's so flexible and so extensible, it actually requires a significant amount of time to actually implement it within your application. And so we're going to walk through the files that Visual Studio creates for us so that we can see how it's set up and how it runs. This demonstration is going to take a look at the new ASP.NET Identity feature. To do this, we need to start up a new project. So we'll do File, New, Project. I'm going to click on ASP.NET Web Application. We'll leave the default name for the project the same and click OK. We'll come up here and click the MVC template, and we'll make sure that we have the MVC folders and core references checked. For authentication, we're not going to be changing the authentication. We're going to be leaving it set to individual user accounts, which will install the infrastructure needed for the ASP.NET Identity. Click OK. We don't require any unit tests for this project, and we are not going to be hosting this project in the cloud. We'll click OK. As we can see, Visual Studio has created our new project. We will rebuild it. And it successfully rebuilt, and now we will run it. All right, our web page has loaded. So as we can look up here in the upper right-hand corner, we have two options. We have the option to register and the option to log in. So I'm going to go ahead and click on register and register myself with the website. There are 3 fields that I need to fill out. The first one is my email address. So I'm going to type in ericwgreen.com. Next, I need to type in a password. So I'm going to type in a weak password. And I'm going to attempt to register, and it's going to come back with an error. Passwords must have at least one non-letter or digit character. So I'm going to go ahead and type in my password again with my one non-letter and non-digit character. And now I'm going to click register. So now I am registered with my website. I can actually come up here and click on my name, and I have the ability to manage my account. I can change my password, I can manage external logins. No two-factor authentication providers are set up, but if we had that set up, I'd be able to manage my two-factor authentication. And so this is basically what you get out of the box when you include the identity, ASP.NET Identity in a brand new project. I have the ability to log off. If I go to any of the application pages, you'll see where it has hello with my email address up there at the top. And I can come up here and click log off. And then I'm still on the home page, but now I'm logged out. And if I wanted to log back in, I could come here and I can type in my login, put my password in, and then I can click login. And now I have logged into my website. So now let's go take a look at the code that makes all this happen. All right, so let's take a look at the code that actually makes this happen. Now, if you remember, ASP.NET Identity makes use of the Owen framework. So if we come in here and we go to the startup file, there's actually a startup file that actually gets started up with the Owen framework, with that Owen standard. And so there's actually an attribute up here that says assembly Owen startup attribute, and this is the class that gets started up to support the Owen capabilities. And as you can see here, there's actually a configuration method that's called. So let's go ahead and follow this configuration method, and let's see what's going on behind the scenes. So if I right-click on Configure Auth, I can actually go to the definition, and we'll come in here and we're actually going to see a bunch of configuration code which is setting up Owen for our application with the ASP.NET Identity. So we have this app builder object which gets passed in. And the first thing that happens is we need to create some singleton objects for our OWIN context. The first one that we're creating here is this application DB context. This particular object is our entity framework object. This is actually going to point to the database where our user and profile information is stored for ASP.NET Identity. The next thing that we have here is an object, a singleton object, being created for our user manager. This object is going to manage information about our user. The next object that we're going to create a singleton of is the sign-in manager. And so this is going to be our object that's going to manage our signing in process. Now, for the OWIN framework, we only want singletons of these. So by calling this create per OWIN context, we're basically creating a singleton of each of these objects. Now, what you see being passed in here into each of these methods, this application DB context.create, application user manager.create, and application sign-in manager.create, these are actually static methods that actually create the instances of these various objects. So for example, if we went to application DB context, we go in here, we actually see the static method that returns an object of type application DB context, and basically it calls our constructor returning our application DB context class. And this little call to the base constructor here is actually passing in our connection string information. So if we go back to our startup or our configure auth, sorry about that. The next thing that we're going to do is set up the fact that we're going to be using cookie-based authentication. At the heart of this, the underlying technology for managing session state and managing your logged in status is really, the underlying technology is really very much the same. This is a standard cookie-based authentication system, very similar to other authentication systems that have been used in ASP.NET in the past. It's just we're going to be using cookies here to track the identity information for our user. So here we're going to create this new cookie authentication options object. We're going to set the authentication type to application cookie. The login path is going to be the path to the login form. And then for our cookie authentication provider, we're going to set up some basic information here to configure our cookie authentication. We're going to set our validate interval to a time span of 30 minutes. And we're going to set our generate user identity async function for regenerating our identity. Next, we're going to use this app use external sign-in cookie. Basically, we're setting this up to use external cookies for signing in if that's something that we want to have in our application. Also, we're going to set up our use two-factor sign-in. So what's two-factor authentication? Two-factor authentication, in a traditional system, we use something called single-factor authentication. Basically, a user provides a username and a password, and then they gain access to the system. In two-factor authentication, we're basically setting it up so that a person has to provide two pieces of information in order to access a system. One piece of information would be the username and password. Perhaps a second piece of information would be a code that's sent via text message to their phone, or a code that's sent via email, or some type of code generation app like Google Authenticator, that the user has to use that code in addition to their username and password in order to access the system. One of the great things about ASP.NET Identity is that it supports this right out of the box. And you can actually see where this starts to be set up right here in the default template code created with your new application. Now down here you can see where you can actually start to integrate into the different third-party providers. The code is commented out because you actually have to go to these third-party providers and sign up for the service and create your client ID in secret. But basically you can directly connect into the Microsoft account authentication, Twitter, Facebook, Google authentication, right from your ASP.NET application with ASP.NET Identity. Now let's scroll up again. And let's take a little bit closer look at this application user manager object. So we're going to go to the definition of it. And so down here, we see a constructor. And it accepts a parameter of type IUserStore. This is the actual storage location where the information for the users is located. And this becomes important because the user manager is going to need to know where to go to get information. Next, we have the create method. The create method is that static method that actually creates our application user manager object. As part of creating that, there's a bunch of different things that we are going to be configuring. For example, when there's a new user in the system, we want to validate certain things about their user account. In this case, we're saying allow only alphanumeric usernames. That's set default, so you can have characters other than alphanumeric characters. Require unique email. This is set to true. So we can't have multiple user accounts in our system that have the same email. Password validator. Required length. Password has to be at least 6 characters. If you remember, when I registered the first time, I didn't include any special characters. I only had letters and digits. Well, if you look here at the password validator, require non-letter or digit in the password. So when I didn't include the non-letter or digit, it gave me the error. And then once I included it, it was an acceptable password. One of the great things about ASP.NET Identity, it makes it very easy to configure the various rules that your passwords have to have in order to be valid. And then down here you can configure additional information such as user lockout enabled, default account lockout time span. So if someone's trying to hack into a user's account, in this case if they failed more than 5 times, then that account will be locked out for a time span of 5 minutes. Now here we're going to register some 2-factor authentication providers. You can do it by phone, you can do it by email. So let's say, for example, you're using a service like Twilio. You can connect this into Twilio and then be able to send SMS messages to the user's phone with the code so they can complete the login process. Or if you're using an email service like SendGrid, you could do the same thing, but instead of using an SMS message, you can send an actual email message to the user so they can get that security code and then log in. And there's some basic defaults here set up for configuring this in the default application, but in order to really make use of this, you'd actually have to connect this to some third-party providers. Okay, this next object is to configure the application sign-in manager. And basically this is going to handle the signing in process for our application. The Visual Studio project template creates this for us. The next thing that we're going to want to take a look at are a number of the models that are created to support the identity framework here. All right, so the first model that we have here is the application user model, and it inherits from the identity user object. Now we can actually add additional profile data here by adding additional properties to this object. The generate user identity async actually uses the user manager to create the claims identity for our particular user here. It's very important that in the create identity async that we actually pass a type of authentication type we're doing so that it actually knows how to create that user identity. And then down here we have our application DB context, which we looked at a little while ago. Actually, this is just handling the entity framework part of actually connecting to our database. Another model file that we want to take a look at is the account view models. So these are the view models that are used on the various forms in the identity, in the application that we've created with ASP.NET Identity. Everything from allowing us to actually log in and register, to verify codes, all of these are created here for you. In this models file, we have some of the view models that are used on the various pages in the system. We have our index view model, we have our manage logins view model, our factor view model, our set password view model, and our change password view model, add phone number view model, verify phone number view model, and configure 2-factor view model. So as you go through your application and you're adding these various capabilities and editing them, you'll want to come back to this file and update these view models to reflect your changes. And so as you can see by the number of classes and configurations and capabilities of ASP.NET Identity, It is very flexible and very extensible, but it also requires a significant amount of setup in order to use it in your application.